In this unit, Unit 4, we are going to pick apart a little bit our collective understanding of Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Um, in many ways, it is considered the most important Supreme Court case of the 20th century. Um, it is a pivotal and critically important case, not only in educational history and educational policy, but our social history and policy, and moves towards racial equity and justice. It is, in many ways, an archetypal moment in U.S. history, which thus makes it really hard to look at critically. But we're going to try. Um, because while Brown is important, it is inarguably important, um, it is also misunderstood. And in many ways, what we think we know about the Brown decision is more mythology than historical fact. And so we are going to use this lecture to put the readings in conversation together in order to do some pulling apart of the mythology and facts of the historical context of Brown, um, pulling apart the mythology and facts of the effects of Brown, and then thinking about segregation and desegregation today. So let's start with the historical context. Brown, as we read in the article by Dudziak, is a Cold War case. And for many people, this is new information. Because as Dudziak lays out, Brown is often considered separate, right? The civil rights movement is considered separate from the Cold War, that these are two parallel histories that are not intersecting, but that they are happening simultaneously. And yet they are deeply interwoven. So I want to talk a little bit, as Dudziak does, about the role of foreign policy in the international community in ensuring that Brown was decided as it was. Keep in mind that the UN was founded in 1945, 9 years before Brown, right? And the US was a global leader in that process of founding and chartering the United Nations. And one of the things from the very beginning of that chartering process of the United Nations that the Soviet Union kept bringing forward the idea that the United States should not be a global leader in talking about human rights. That the United States should not be a global leader in talking about protecting oppressed people around the world. And that the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc kept bringing up, rightfully so, the example of the treatment of African Americans in the United States. And so here I have two books, images of books that were presented to the UN. They were petitions to the UN on behalf of African Americans in the United States once the UN was founded, asking the UN to act on behalf of the human rights violations of African Americans in the United States. The one on the right, An Appeal to the World, was prepared and written by the NAACP under the leadership of Walter White, 1947. And it was a document that laid out the ways in which the human rights, the fundamental human rights that were guaranteed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, written by the United Nations, chartering nations, right? The way in which the United States violated the fundamental human rights of Black Americans. Several years later, in 1951, a second petition, We Charge Genocide, which was authored by W.E.B. Du Bois, again, on behalf of African Americans, even stronger case, right? So not only about human rights, but about that the actions that the U.S. government and the U.S. population has taken towards and against African Americans is nothing less than genocide. These two petitions were widely seen by the American government, Eleanor Roosevelt in particular, as embarrassments, as blemishes. They didn't want this talked about on the international stage. And yet, talking about racial inequality and racial injustice in the United States on an international stage provided fodder for ensuring that something as unpopular as brown to white Americans would get passed. It was in foreign policy interests to pass brown. This also becomes important later when we talk about how brown was actually enacted and the idea of with all deliberate speed and why it was phrased as such. So one myth about brown is that it was just sort of like the inevitable forward progress of the civil rights movement, and that the United States was eventually going to realize what was right and what was just, and brown was decided. It was unanimous because it was so morally right. End of story. When in fact, it's much more complicated than that. Right? Brown was unanimous in part because the Chief Justice knew it was deeply unpopular, and unless there was a unanimous finding from the court, it was going to be contested. It was still contested, but can you imagine if it did not have the full backing of the Supreme Court? Okay, let's add another historical context, myth and fact. We often think about brown, the historical context, as really being just about African Americans. And that's not true. As we read in the article this week on Chinese American exclusion and segregation, as we read in the Wollenberg article several units ago, Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans were heavily discriminated against, largely on the West Coast. That's where they were concentrated in terms of their communities, but not only on the West Coast. On the left, you see the family from the case Tate versus Hurley. On the right, you see the family from Gong Lum versus Rice. Tate versus Hurley was a case from 1885 in San Francisco. Gong Lum versus Rice was a case in 1927 in Mississippi. Both of these cases were about Chinese exclusion from public schools and Chinese segregation in public schools. So in Tate versus Hurley, the family on the left, Mamie Tate, was the girl in the middle who was not allowed to attend the white school. In fact, she was not allowed to attend public school. At the time, and as you read about in the Quo article, Chinese were not merely segregated at the time in California, they were excluded. They were banned from public schools. And so they had an alternate educational system, but Chinese Americans had enough, right? And the case from Mamie Tate, ensured that in California, Chinese Americans would be given access to public schools. However, those schools remained segregated. The Gong Lum versus Rice case was a case about segregation. And it wasn't so much a case about whether or not segregation was legal. It was a case about whether Chinese Americans should be considered white or, quote, colored. The case, right, so the Gong Lum children were not allowed to attend the white school in Mississippi. And in this case, it was determined ultimately that was the legal choice because Chinese Americans were not white. They were considered, quote, colored. So there was vehement and voracious racism towards Chinese Americans. Exclusion, segregation, contestations over where they fit into the U.S. social order. But these were cases that were looked at very carefully by the NAACP as they were mounting their legal strategy for Brown, and yet we don't often talk about the precedent of other ethnic groups and racial groups leading up to Brown. Similarly, we have a case also from California, Mendez versus Westminster. Here we have a picture of Mendez, and now I'm blanking on her first name, Sylvia Mendez. Of Sylvia Mendez, the young woman in the case that went before the California Supreme Court and ultimately ended up ending separate but equal in California. But again, there was a strategy here of positioning or of questioning whether or not Mexican Americans should be considered white or colored. Ultimately, in this case, That became a moot point because separate but equal was ostensibly outlawed after Mendez versus Westminster. This too became a precedent case for the legal strategy of the ACLU, of the NAACP in arguing Brown. And Mendez versus Westminster was 1946, so 8 years before Brown. Another myth around Brown and the historical context was that segregated schooling was unilaterally horrific for Black Americans. And as Vanessa Siddle Walker argues in her piece, that simply wasn't the case. There were, separate was not equal. There were no educators that would argue that that was the case. But there were strengths and there was excellence in segregated schooling. As you saw in the video, Black educators pre-Brown were often more qualified than their white counterparts. We had schools that were led completely by Black administrators and Black teachers, and so the focus within those schools became on what we would call today culturally relevant pedagogies, abolitionist pedagogies that were simultaneously about academics, but also self-love, also a sense of heritage, also a sense of empowerment. And that was part of the context pre-Brown. In addition, Black educators as a collective were very powerful. They had their own teaching organizations, right? Equivalents to the teachers' unions and organizations for white teachers. And those powerful collectives of teachers were important players in the strategy, the legal strategy for Brown. And they're often not talked about, right? Often it is talked about as if Linda Brown and her family just rose up out of nowhere to sue the Topeka School District, when in fact there was a half-century long strategy in which Black educators played a pivotal role. So just the historical context of Brown is so much more complicated than a continuous progress towards what is morally right for Black Americans, serendipitously towards that, right? There are important contexts that made Brown what it is. So let's talk about Brown. The Brown cases, of which there are actually two, right? So Brown is actually a series of cases. It's not only about Linda Brown and the Topeka School District. It's a series of cases from around the country that were argued under the single title of Brown v. Board. And in 1954, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the doctrine of separate but equal is unjust. That where there is separation, there can be no equality, right? So the Supreme Court unanimously struck down segregation as a constitutional policy, but they didn't say how. They took another year to hear the individual cases and the specifics re-argued, and in Brown 2, they ordered schools in the South to desegregate with all deliberate speed. And this was the only direction that the Supreme Court gave about how to desegregate. And so a second area that we need to dissect when we're talking about Brown to understand it is how desegregation actually happened. It wasn't that in 1954 the Supreme Court said separate is inherently unequal and magically everything desegregated in the United States. We know that's not true. We've seen pictures of Little Rock, right? We've seen pictures of Alabama. We know what happened when Black students tried to desegregate schools. They were met with violent resistance. So what actually happened? A number of different things. One of the strategies used in the South in particular was the idea of freedom of choice, that families could choose where to send their children to schools and that would be the solution. The reality was that schools remained segregated, right? We also had the issue of demanding desegregation in the South, where there were laws enforcing segregation, but in the North, where there were not laws per se, schools were still segregated. And so we had this issue of de facto, which means it just kind of happens by chance, and de jure, or it happens by law. When desegregation did happen, we saw the loss of Black educational spaces. Right? Desegregation in practice meant that Black students were moved into white schools. And so they lost Black teachers, Black administrators, culturally relevant curricula, all of the excellence that was in segregated educational spaces. Again, not saying that segregation was excellent, but that within this unequal system, Black educators found a way to teach toward excellence, towards cultural relevance, towards self-love, towards heritage, towards community, towards social change. That was lost. Black educators were fired en masse. We saw when desegregation was happening, we saw violent resistance repeatedly, not only in the South, in the North as well. Boston in particular, right, erupted into tremendous violent resistance when Boston was ordered to desegregate later. We saw busing, and again, the busing of Black students into white schools. And eventually we saw the court get involved through consent decrees, through the court coming in to school districts to say this is how you must desegregate. So desegregation did not magically happen in 1954. It was a long process that did not happen with all deliberate speed. It was a long, drawn-out process that took decades until the late 80s was the historical moment when U.S. schools were the least segregated. Now, I also want to point out this idea with all deliberate speed and that this is the only direction that the Supreme Court gave. Historians argue that this is not accidental, that on a foreign policy level, all the United States needed to do was to show that the federal government was serious about racial justice. And that then, leaving it up to the states, it could simply be that the federal government is serious, but we have this issue around states' rights in our country. So it's not that we're violating human rights. We're not. We're guaranteeing by law through our Supreme Court that separate is inherently unequal. It's just that states have a lot of power and some states are worse than others. And so with all deliberate speed, allowed that argumentation to happen, right? It allowed Southern states to continue as they had been continuing. So if we were to look at the process of how desegregation happened, there were countless numbers of cases after 1954 that laid out the plan of how desegregation can and should happen. And they really start in 1968. So I have a series of Supreme Court cases here, except for one, which was not a Supreme Court case. I believe it was a U.S. District Court case, and I'll explain that in a minute. But so in 1968, we have Green versus New Kent County in Virginia. So 14 years after Brown 1 was decided, the Supreme Court finally says, hey, South, the way you've been attempting to desegregate is inadequate. 14 years pass between Brown 1 and Green when the court finally says enough is enough. You need to get serious about this. The following year, a similar case, right? Alexander versus Holmes in Mississippi, 1969. Again, Southern schools must desegregate immediately, right? This is finally now 15 years later, the Supreme Court is saying you've got to get serious. In 1970, so this case in italics, Cisneros versus Corpus Christi, is a case from Texas. I believe it was a U.S. District Court where this was argued. But it raised the question of school funding. Because remember, it was in 1970 that Mexican Americans were identified as an ethnic minority. Until 1970, Brown didn't apply to them. It was in 1970 when Mexican Americans in Cisneros versus Corpus Christi were identified as an ethnic minority facing a history of discrimination that Brown's declaration of separate but separate is inherently unequal could finally be applied to Mexican Americans in the United States. In 1971, we begin to see more cases about the how of desegregation. So Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg in 1971, Black parents sued the Charlotte Mecklenburg School District for not following through on desegregation. And the Supreme Court ruled that mandatory busing would be allowed and would be ordered in order to desegregate a district. That busing would be the means of doing that. In 1973, Keyes versus School District 1 in Denver, Colorado, busing came up again because Colorado now, you'll notice this is a northern state. It did not have de jure segregation, but the case was brought forward by Mexican American and Black families that Colorado schools were segregated and that they should be mandated to desegregate as well. And the court said, you're right. The court said, yes, de facto segregation, even though it may not have been codified in the way that de jure segregation was, districts can be remanded to desegregate, and mandatory busing could be implemented in Denver. So this was the first mandating of desegregation in the North, of de facto segregation. In 1973, we have a case out of Texas, San Antonio versus Rodriguez, which started to argue that desegregating within districts still wasn't entirely fair because there was still inequality. If separate is inherently unequal, what do we do about inequality broadly in terms of funding? Wanting to argue that property tax funding reinforced those inequalities and thus was unconstitutional, that property tax funding was like a proxy for segregation. In this case, the Supreme Court drew a line and they said, no, does not violate the Equal Protection Clause. Property tax funding is a completely legal and constitutional way to fund schools. It just so happens that funding will be really unequal. So a line was drawn there, right? We've got busing as a strategy. We've expanded who Brown applies to. We're saying no, freedom of choice plans are not enough on their own, but you can't shimmy unless we're not going to mandate that you play with funding formulas. Then in 1974, Milliken versus Bradley in Detroit really stretched this idea of mandatory busing and thinking across district lines. So in the Detroit metro area, schools, while within districts, schools might not be segregated. What was noticed, and this is a pattern that you will continue to see in northern cities today, between districts, there was tremendous segregation, right? Two districts next to each other could have very different racial compositions that amounted to segregation between districts. And so the case was suing the legality of an inter-district busing plan, because that's what Detroit was trying, the Metro Detroit area, was mandating busing between districts. So regardless of which district you live in, you could be reassigned in order to desegregate across a metro area. And here the Supreme Court drew a line again, and they said no. Unless those town and school district boundaries were drawn with racist intent, we are not within our legal means to mandate desegregation across those boundaries. So unless there is racial intent, we're not going to intervene. Fast forward to 2007, which in many ways is considered the time when desegregation ended in the United States. Parents Involved versus Seattle. It also involved a case in Louisville, Kentucky. Or in Parents Involved versus Seattle, the Supreme Court, so many of these prior cases were about cases where there was mandated desegregation, consent decrees from the court. In Seattle and in Louisville, there were not court-ordered desegregation. These were voluntary desegregation plans within the district. Not voluntary by parents, voluntary by the district. That the district looked at their racial makeup and said, we need to do something about this. Busing plans, school choice plans, different ways to create racial balance in schools in Seattle and in Louisville, Kentucky. The Parents Involved group in Seattle, and I don't remember the name of the group in Louisville, but Parents Involved in Seattle were parents who felt that this system harmed their children. So these were typically, but not entirely, white parents who wanted their kids to attend neighborhood schools. And the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the parents and said that if you engage in voluntary desegregation plans, they have to be very narrowly tailored. Again, hearkening back to this idea of racist intent, that you have to be trying to fix racist intent and not simply racially disparate outcomes. So look at that timeline. Brown was passed in 1954. The Supreme Court was hearing desegregation cases until 2007. The United States did not magically desegregate, nor is it magically desegregated today. As I was looking for different news stories and charts, I saw this article from NPR in the top left corner. 2016, a Mississippi school is still being ordered to desegregate. 2016. Also, if we look in the top right corner, we can see these are that graph is from the New York Times. We can look at processes of desegregation. You can see that the U.S. was at its least segregated in the late 80s. I believe that 1988 is the year that we often point to as when the United States was the least segregated. And we've been seeing resegregation ever since. And then we can look at the effects of that. One of the arguments that's made, particularly by Nikole Hannah-Jones in her work on school and neighborhood desegregation, and that is borne out in data, is that if we look at quantitative data, desegregation was good for students across the board, but in particular for Black students. And so here we have a graphic representation, which you're probably familiar with, of the achievement gap in reading, and I say that in quotes, because if you haven't read Gloria Ladson-Billings from the Education Debt, or from the Achievement Gap to the Education Debt, you should. Challenges this very idea and preoccupation as being one that is fundamentally racist. But let's look at this data, because what we see in 1988, when schools were at their least segregated, when they were most desegregated, we see the smallest outcomes gap between Black and white students. Now, a lot of attention has been focused on understanding why that was, which we're not going to get into in our history course. That would be great for a sociology course, for a research methods course, for critical inquiry. But here, suffice it to say, desegregation was slow and desegregation was incomplete. We are not desegregated today. In fact, the United States now is the most segregated it's been since Brown. Think about that for a moment. And that this map is actually, it's a little misleading because segregation is at higher levels in northeastern cities than in southern cities. Think about that. Look at this map. School segregation is the highest it has been in decades. Did Brown succeed? We also talk about Brown as a success, a historical success in the civil rights movement. But this map, these charts, would raise a question of whether that's true. Which then leads us to this question as well. Is there a difference between talking about desegregation or integration? So Vanessa Siddle-Walker reminded us that Black educators pre-Brown and post-Brown saw integration as an additive process. There was excellence happening in segregated schools, but that excellence had systemic limitations due to funding disparities, due to resource disparities, due to access, right? And so the hope was that desegregation or integration would be a process by which what was excellent would be maintained and there would be equality of funding and opportunities. That's really different than what the court engaged in when it was engaging in desegregation decrees. Court-ordered desegregation was simply about legal racial balancing of students, not of teachers, not of administrators, not of communities, of students in a school building. When a balance was achieved, the school was considered desegregated. So we can see that those are two very different ideas, right? And then, as we read about in the San Miguel article, bilingual education raises a whole other question. Because bilingual education, by definition, is going to create segregated school environments. And yet, it is a right in the United States. And so how do we balance ideas such as bilingual education and ethnocentric schools, right? Like the African American Immersion Academy here in Milwaukee. How do we balance those with ideas of separate being inherently unequal? And the idea of integration as an additive process versus racial balancing. And so here you can understand how scholars like Derek Bell, who is in the recommended reading list, we didn't read him this week, would argue that perhaps a fully realized Plessy might have been better than what happened to Black students and Black teachers. That's a really controversial position, right? But his argument is not that integration is bad. It's that the way that we did it in the United States, the way we desegregated with, quote, all deliberate speed, and then like only kind of desegregated, that did more harm than good.